Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for your time. This past week was a valuable week for the channel. 2 days of briefings at the Johnson Space Center in Houston provided a lot of information about the upcoming Artemis II lunar test flight. The media event provided the rare chance to dig into the details of this upcoming mission to fly astronauts around the moon for the first time in over 50 years. Interview slots with the 4 people who will fly Orion around the moon are still governed by old school media rules that existed well before YouTube was a thing. So it wasn't a surprise that I didn't get an opportunity to interview any of the 4 flight crew members. But there's a large team that supports the crew and the vehicle before, during, and after the flight, and we don't often get the chance to interact with them either. That opportunity was well worth making the trip. In this video, I'll give you my initial takeaways and impressions from the visit to JSC. And there's more to come to preview Artemis II in future videos. During the week, NASA's Johnson Space Center hosted a 3-day media event. The newest class of astronauts were introduced on Monday, September 22nd. Technically, they are still astronaut candidates until they graduate from 2 years of training to become active astronauts eligible for assignment to missions that could include future Artemis missions. Tuesday and Wednesday, the 23rd and 24th, focused on briefings about the Artemis II lunar flyby test flight. There's a lot to unpack from the Artemis II briefings that were live streamed and the behind-the-scenes looks or workshops or whatever you might call the additional presentations in different buildings at JSC. The training team, the science and engineering support teams, and the flight control teams made presentations, provided overviews, and answered questions about the mission and getting ready for the mission first. It was an early orientation on those topics. I'm hoping to take the material from this and do dedicated videos before Artemis II, and the information provided is the beginnings of a mission preview. One of the things that was reinforced is the similarity to an old-style space shuttle mission, which were often in that 10-day to 2-week duration and were scripted down to multiple increments per hour. Artemis II pilot Victor Glover sort of hinted about this during the crew's news conference on Wednesday, September 24th.
So, the mission is 10 days, 9-point-something days, and we're going to go fly by the moon on the 6th day. I just want to share with you a little bit about the first day. And so here's a picture of the timeline, and I know that that's too small for it to be really useful to you, but I'm just going to keep holding this up here because you can at least tell that there's a bunch of different colored lines on this chart, and I'm going to talk about a few of them. And the first one is that we actually start the day that we launch 7 hours before launch, waking up in crew quarters to get medical checks and a weather brief and to work with our team to start making sure that we're ready to go out to the launch. And when the Exploration Ground Systems team and the team in launch control says that things are looking good and send their crew, we'll drive out to the pad. And so 3 to 4 hours prior, we'll start to ingress the vehicle. And then he talked about the stack weighing about 3.5 million pounds. When it's all fueled up, it'll be about 5.5 million pounds, but 8.8 million pounds of thrust at sea level. Mass flow is going to rocket us towards space. And about 9 minutes after that, we'll be in space. And then the day gets even busier. Now, we've been up for almost a full workday at this point.
Perhaps the headline from the briefings was that the crew named their spacecraft. Commander Reed Weissman made the announcement during the news conference after the crew's opening remarks.
Do we have time to maybe cover naming the spacecraft?
I think so.
Okay. How many of you were here on Monday for the big event? I won't make you stand up like Amit, but this place was packed on Monday. This stage was packed on Monday. We had Secretary Duffy here. We had Senator Cruz, we had Congressman Babin and LZ, we had all of our leadership, Amit, our associate administrator. It was an amazing event as we announced 10 new astronauts here at the Johnson Space Center. So this has just been a week filled with amazing energy. And when I look at 2026, the year ahead, we're going 250,000 miles from planet Earth. And it just so coincidentally happens to be the 250th anniversary of the United States of America. So we'll see if we can play those two numbers together just a few thousand times on this mission. But it definitely gets us fired up. So a couple months ago, we thought as a crew, we need to name this spacecraft. We need to have a name for the Orion spacecraft that we're going to ride this magical mission on. And so we got the 4 of us together and our backups, Jenny Gibbons from the Canadian Space Agency and Andre Douglas from NASA. And we went over to the quarantine facility here and we basically locked ourselves in there until we came up with a name. And it was amazing. We started with like a lot of names. I mean, there were names that I loved. There were names that Christina loved. We all had our little pet names. And as we worked our way through this, we went big to small, which this crew does so well. And we started with the NASA core values. And then we looked at the Canadian Space Agency core values. And then we talked about what matters to us most in our core values. And then we looked out at what is going on with Artemis II. What do we want this to be? We want it to be success for Artemis III, but Jeremy hit it. You know, peace and hope for all humankind. That is what we really want. And so we are bringing together the world. We are bringing together an amazing workforce, and they are bringing together an amazing vehicle. And at the end of all that, when you squeeze it all down, it created magic. So we're going to fly around the moon in the spacecraft Integrity. Thank you.
The mission overview briefing, the crew news conference, and some of the overviews provided to the media at JSC provided a more detailed outline of the mission. Flight Day 1 and the early part of Flight Day 2 are pretty well known. I've gone through those in previous videos. In summary, Artemis II is planned as a 3-orbit mission. The SLS booster and core stage insert into the initial low-ish Earth orbit. Then ICPS performs a long burn into a high Earth orbit, raising the apoapsis or apogee of the orbit up to around 40,000 nautical miles, or about 74,000 kilometers. That orbit has a period of about 24 hours, but also a perigee of 0. The long orbit gives the flight control team the chance to do a long evaluation of the performance of Orion's environmental control and life support systems. The first crew sleep period is divided into 2 4-hour blocks with a perigee raise burn in the middle. That readjusts the perigee back to 100 nautical miles or 185 kilometers again. After the crew's second nap, assuming everyone is go for the Orion burn, the spacecraft will make a translunar injection burn that raises the apogee out to the moon. That third and final orbit will take over a week to complete. The TLI burn occurs towards the beginning of Flight Day 2. Artemis II is a test flight, and at that point the crew will work with the flight control team to perform several flight test objectives evaluating the performance characteristics of all the new systems flying for the first time on this mission. On the way out to the moon, they will test Orion in different attitudes to validate and better anchor thermal models. Once the specific lunar trajectory is known, the science team will be able to refine the observation plan for the close approach to the moon, and as that day approaches, the spacecraft will be configured for the lunar flyby. Most of that flight day will be devoted to the science plan, with the focus on a 3-hour window around closest approach. Orion will go behind the moon, out of contact with Earth for about 45 minutes. Overnight after the flyby, the flight control team will be dumping onboard data for a conference between the science team and the crew to get additional context from their observations. The TLI burn back on Flight Day 2 puts the spacecraft on a free return trajectory. It's both a TLI burn and a deorbit burn. As a complicating reminder, it's just the last deorbit burn of the mission, the only one without a perigee raise later on. The briefings provided a lot more detail on the front half of the mission and the lunar flyby. After that, Orion and crew are headed home. On re-entry day, they will separate from the service module, re-enter, and splash down in the Pacific Ocean after a mission of about 10 days. We got a good deal more detail than that, so there's more to unpack for more mission preview videos later. There were signs in a few of the buildings we walked through saying there's 20 weeks to launch, perhaps, depending on when those were last updated. There's about 100 days left in this year, 20 weeks is 140 days, and that puts you about a month and change into 2026. There were stronger hints like that, and in the briefings that the goal is to be ready for the February launch period. Maybe that's partly because this was the first opportunity in a while to hear from many of the principals about planning for the mission. We've been getting a periodic feed of imagery from Kennedy Space Center as Exploration Ground Systems prepares the SLS and Orion flight hardware for launch. But this was the first time in a long time that we heard about planning for the mission and when they're planning to launch. To be fair, NASA exploration officials said late last year that their goal was to have the Artemis II vehicle ready to roll to the pad for launch by the end of this year, and they said at the time if the hardware was ready by the end of the year, the people would be ready. Nevertheless, this was the first time in a while we got details about that. One of the takeaways from the event in Houston is a stronger sense that EGS has stayed close to the schedules for their goal, and that would mean the first realistic opportunity is the February launch period. Eric Berger reported in an Ars Technica story on Tuesday after the first two Artemis II briefings, and a later social media post, that a 32-minute-long launch window on February 5th would be the first opportunity in that launch period. During the mission overview briefing Tuesday morning, Artemis launch director Charlie Blackwell-Thompson talked about an approximately 18-day-long pad flow leading up to a first launch attempt. I've gone through an estimated pad flow timeline based on a previous interview with Artemis II mission manager Matt Ramsey back in March, but if we put a stake in the ground on February 5th for this hypothetical pad flow and work backwards, 18 days takes us back to mid-January for a rollout to the pad around January 18th or 19th. In a recent interview with EGS Vehicle Operations Manager Matt Check, we heard that there's something like a couple of weeks of time-critical rollout preps in front of that. So that would loosely line up with a vehicle that was ready for those final rollout preps around Christmas time. Charlie Blackwell-Thompson also provided a little update on the status of launch processing by EGS.
For us, Orion is in its final preparations in what we call our offline processing. It is currently in the launch abort facility, launch abort system facility, or the LASF as we call it back at Kennedy, and it is finishing up its processing there. We expect that to complete in about a week or so, and then it'll be headed over to the Vehicle Assembly Building, or the VAB. The SLS rocket is pretty much stacked and ready to go. Its test campaign is behind it. We are finishing up some of our closeouts and some of our other work, but most of our work there on SLS is behind us, which is a wonderful milestone. Later this week, we plan to stack the Orion stage adapter. It does have some payloads on board it that'll be going along for the ride with us, some CubeSats, so we're looking forward to that as well. Once Orion is complete over in the LASF, we'll bring it over to the VAB. It will get mated to the SLS rocket, and we'll begin our test campaign.
I also got a chance to speak to a couple of officials with the SLS program who were there as a part of the media briefings, and they noted that the 4 strakes are now installed in already added mounting equipment on the core stage inner tank. The strakes were added around forward booster to core stage attach points to reduce buffeting during transonic flight around a minute after liftoff. That hardware will get some additional foam sprays before that work is complete. NASA KSC Public Affairs also confirmed that the Orion stage adapter for Artemis II was transported from the Multi-Payload processing facility to the Vehicle Assembly Building on Wednesday, September 24th. I'd asked about the status of the 4th CubeSat that was being prepared by Argentina, but haven't heard any update on that. We saw still images of the other 3 secondary payloads installed in dispensers in the OSA earlier in the month. For what it's worth, when the CubeSats were noted in the pre-flight briefings this past week in Houston, they were referred to as 3 CubeSats as opposed to 4. As I noted in a previous video, we saw a similar situation with Artemis I, where over a dozen CubeSats were originally manifested, but the flight launched with 10. Now that the OSA is in the VAB, it will be prepared for lifting into High Bay 3 and mating with the top of the ICPS. The 2 elements will be permanently bolted together. During the mission, when Orion separates from the SLS second stage a few hours after launch, it will leave the ICPS, OSA, and its own spacecraft adapter cone together. The launch director also noted during the mission overview briefing that the planned hold points in the countdown were adjusted for Artemis II, now that SLS and Orion will be flying crews to the moon. During Artemis I, the almost 2-day-long countdown had 2 built-in holds. The clock stopped at T-minus 6 hours 40 minutes, which was the decision point for the mission management team whether or not to proceed with propellant loading, also called tanking. That hold was 3.5 hours long. The final hold was at T-minus 10 minutes and was the decision point for the MMT whether or not the vehicle was go for launch. As we saw on Artemis I and some other vehicles, those holds can be extended. But Artemis I was uncrewed. Now, with the Artemis II crew taking Orion around the moon, Charlie Blackwell-Thompson noted in the briefing that a new hold point was added. The planned holds are also points in the countdown where the launch team can catch up to the overall timeline while the clock is stopped. SLS has shuttle heritage hardware and designs, and like shuttle, which was always crewed, there were holds on launch day before tanking started and after tanking was complete. That is called stable replenish, and it's the point where it's safe for the flight crew and closeout crew to approach the fully fueled vehicle. Stable replenish is the point where the propellant tank is full and a very low flow rate of propellant is put into the bottom of the tank to sync with the rate of boil-off of propellant at the top. That contrasts with higher flow rates and higher pressures in the feed lines while the large tanks are being filled. A propellant leak during the fast fill part of tanking is more likely to spill a lot more hazardous fluid or gas than a leak during stable replenish. The crews won't head out to the pad until all 4 cryogenic propellant tanks are in stable replenish. If there are any hiccups during fueling, this new hold provides a little bit of time to catch up to the overall timeline. Right after the briefing, I asked Charlie what the time was on the clock where the new hold starts and how long it was. She didn't have the numbers with her, but she did also note that the first hold, back when the MMT decides to tank the vehicle or not, was also adjusted. I followed up with Kennedy Space Center Public Affairs, and she got back to me with what the planned holds look like now. We saw the hold durations change a little bit during Artemis I, so these are also subject to change. But here's what the launch day countdown holds look like. The clock will hold at T-minus 8 hours 10 minutes for 2 hours and 15 minutes. The purpose is still basically the same: to finish all the tanking preps, look at the weather forecast, and decide whether or not to tank the vehicle for a launch attempt. The second planned hold, the new one, is at T-minus 3 hours 30 minutes and is 40 minutes in length. That's roughly the point where they'll be looking for tanking to be complete so the crew can get on board. If extra time is needed for all 4 tanks in the 2 stages to be in stable replenish, there's an extra 40 minutes in this hold. The final planned hold at T-minus 10 minutes remains 30 minutes long. I'm sure we'll return to this as we get closer to launch. The wet dress rehearsal tanking tests could be following this same timeline, and it would be educational to be able to follow if NASA will let us do that. Training for the mission will continue for most of those 20 weeks or however long until launch, but the crew sounds ready to go now.
We were in a sim yesterday, Victor and I, and we had a failure. Quick anecdote. We had a failure, and I read the whole failure, but I read one number wrong. I said IMU3 failed, and our instructor behind us was like, it's IMU2, it's IMU2. And Victor turns around and goes, I knew what he meant. It was IMU2. And I was like, it's so great. You know, we don't even have to talk. We know exactly what we're all thinking. So this crew cohesion, we're at the point now where we are ready to go fly. And with that, I will hand it over to my friend Victor.
Oh, man. I don't want to say anything else. I'm ready to go into questions. That was great. Well said, well said.
Talking to some of the people on the training teams, they are getting ready to do another long simulation of the critical opening day of the mission through the TLI burn, which is about 25 hours after liftoff. Artemis II is more focused on testing Orion in its final crew-rated configuration, so SLS isn't being asked to send Orion all the way to the moon on this flight. It did that on Artemis I and will do that again on Artemis III, but on this launch it will stop short, leaving Orion within 24 hours of home, while all its new life support and crew systems are checked out on their first flight. Once Orion leaves for the moon, as the crew and others emphasized this week, almost all their options to come home will take days, and that changes the math on the risks for the crews going to the moon. On Tuesday, when we visited Building 9 and Building 5 at JSC, 2 simulations were running at the same time. The flight crew was training elsewhere, but the flight control team and the support teams in Houston are also practicing their roles for the mission. Building 9 is a space vehicle mock-up facility, and a full-scale mock-up of the crew module in launch configuration is set up there. Building 5 is where the Orion mission simulator is, and a simulation of the lunar flyby day was running when we visited. On Wednesday, we visited Building 30, the Christopher Craft Mission Control Center. We were split into different groups there, so the first stop for us was the new Science Evaluation Room, or SIR, where the science team gave us a presentation about the lunar geology plan for the mission and how the science team and the SIR are involved. Then we went to the Orion Mission Evaluation Room, the MIR, where some of the engineering support team answered questions about their roles and responsibilities, about Orion, and about the mission. The last stop was the White Flight Control Room, which is what we will commonly see during the mission and is commonly referred to as Mission Control. The flight control team, led by flight directors, is in charge of the mission as a whole. The Flight Control Room, or FICR, is the front room where the Capcom will speak to the crew. But they are supported by a multi-purpose support room, or MIPSR, also known as the back room. Everyone is monitoring data on the health, performance, and location of the vehicle and other situational context. The flight controllers at the different console positions are basically conferenced in with backroom controllers for their specialty, simultaneously with the flight director and other flight controllers. That's only 2 of the simultaneous voice loops they may have to process. There could be others. And they're communicating with the crew, asking questions, providing situational awareness, and recommending actions. I got a chance to talk to a mixture of flight controllers at a few different console positions in the time we had in the flight control room, starting with the control and booster positions, which focus on SLS during launch. Then the Flight Dynamics Officer, or FIDO console, and then finally the Integrated Communications Officer, or INCO console. The flight control room will be staffed around the clock, if I recall correctly, beginning when Orion is powered up 2 days before launch. Flight controllers will work 9-hour shifts with a 1-hour overlap to hand over from one shift to the next. So there were a mixture of people from different shifts. So that's a flavor of all the information that I still need to unpack. I got a chance to essentially follow up on some topics multiple times, talking to people in different locations with similar or overlapping disciplines. So this is on my to-do list now. There's plenty more to say about what I saw and heard. I also got a chance to speak with the lead and entry flight directors and senior leaders in the SLS and Orion programs while in Houston, so that's also on the list. Something else that we have to watch is the tropics. The Atlantic hurricane season extends far into the fall now, and a hurricane that passes close to Cape Canaveral or Houston could complicate the schedule for final preparations for this flight. In other news and notes, the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel reported to the public on September 19th on their latest quarterly meeting with NASA back in late July. What makes it more relevant here is that 3 of the members of the panel visited Starbase in South Texas shortly thereafter for private briefings with SpaceX officials on the progress of Starship HLS development. They were widely reported in comments on September 19th, saying that the HLS schedule in support of the Artemis III lunar landing mission was a challenge and that it could be years later than the mid-2027 target date. There will be more to say about this in a later video, but a few notes. The ship-to-ship propellant transfer demonstration remains a critical milestone, since that Starship technology and implementation are critical to HLS. But the bigger question for Artemis is, what is the critical path to get to that demo? What are the milestones and what is the schedule for those? That still remains a secret. Marcia Smith reported in her story for SpacePolicyOnline.com that ASAP also noted possible competing priorities for Starship in the near term. Both HLS providers, SpaceX and Blue Origin, have obligations to perform crewed lunar landing demonstrations, but the financial incentive to do that on a particular schedule is debatable. Starship is a SpaceX product that they are developing for their own commercial purposes. In terms of urgency being a priority, that seems to be more with the US government. However, the government hasn't funded HLS like the lunar landing is urgent. Government investment is smaller for Starship and Blue Moon than those companies' privately raised financial investments. This is a long-standing theme of government funding for NASA. The money doesn't match the rhetoric. That only ever happened once. If the government wanted SpaceX and Blue Origin to make Artemis a higher priority, their level of investment in HLS hasn't necessarily reflected that. As usual, there's a lot more rhetoric. As an example, if we go back to the big beautiful bill, there was a lot of money in that supplemental appropriations for NASA and for Artemis. But none of that extra money was for HLS, either for Starship or for Blue Moon. So that's a first look at the pre-flight briefings for Artemis II. It's been a long time since I visited JSC. These briefings were maybe the first ones in 7 years where I got an opportunity like this, which belies the work that goes on year after year in these programs at all the different centers. This mission has been called Artemis II for 6 years now, but it was Exploration Mission 2 for at least that long before the name change. I put out a video last year about the evolution of the flight, but a large workforce has deliberated about all these details for a long time. I've only been covering parts of NASA for 15 years, but I was never able to convince people that there was a story there. And more than that there were storylines there that persist from week to week. But what I call not enough is what NASA calls too much. Maybe Artemis II will become a footnote in history, like Apollo 10 or Apollo 6, but it's still disappointing not to get a better chance to find out about these missions and those missions, how NASA made them happen as they happened. Thanks as always for watching. Like and subscribe if you find these videos informative and want to find out what's going on with Artemis from week to week. As usual, a big thanks to the members of this YouTube channel who are helping make trips like this one to JSC possible. I'm posting additional videos and frequent updates during the week if you're interested in joining. If you're willing to make a one-time donation to support what I do, I would really appreciate that too. I put a link to my Buy Me a Coffee page in the description. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.